Boldwood presents Daughter of Destiny, written by Lizzie Lane and read by Lucy Scott. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Barbados.
As the eldest son, I have the right to be first.
Sending his chair crashing to the veranda floor, Emmanuel Strong staggered drunkenly to his feet and banged the table with both fists. Opposite him, his back to the trees and the moon, Otis Strong belched, broke wind and shook his head.
Shame on you, brother. Married with 2 children and contemplating adultery. He needs more practice,
exclaimed Jeb, the youngest, and laughed until the tears rolled down his face. It seemed outrageously funny to him. The brothers were alike in looks, tall and square-shouldered, with golden hair erring towards red, and blue eyes that could be as bright as May or cold as December. They were all young, wild to varying degrees, but Emmanuel was the eldest and the dominant male in a pack of young lions. Otis was more lightly built than his older brother, whom he tried to emulate, though being second eldest was second best. Jeb was last in line with regard to inheriting the immense wealth of the Strong family, so felt no need either to compete with or to respect Emmanuel. In fact, he took immense pleasure in mocking his inflated self-esteem. Even now, a smile curled his mouth, almost as though he were daring his brother to turn his words into action. Emmanuel avoided matching Jeb's challenging look and concentrated his attention on Otis, whom he'd always regarded as overly sensitive. Now he looked at him as if he were a complete fool.
My wife's not in Barbados, he snapped. I am, and a man has needs.
Otis grinned, hesitantly.
That's got nothing to do with it. You didn't throw the first 6. Whoever throws the first 6 usually... Neither did you,
Emmanuel interrupted, his voice and countenance surly with drink. They both looked to where Jeb sprawled in a chair, grinning.
To the victor,
he slurred, and waved one hand like the conductor of an imaginary orchestra.
And I will do my best.
Gripping the table for support, he rose unsteadily, almost falling back into his chair, as his knees buckled. Always the easy-going one. He laughed at his own ineptitude.
I don't know that I'll be able... But the prospect of bedding that pretty little thing will no doubt encourage Peter the Pistol to rise to the occasion.
Emmanuel Strong grinned and patted his crotch.
No matter if you can't manage. I'm sure my own willing member can make up for your shortcomings.
All 3 laughed as young men do, when fired up with an overindulgence of Barbadian rum and the prospect of unfettered sex.
Then let's do it!
Otis, the middle brother, who was never wild until he'd drunk a few glasses of rum, sent both glasses and bottles crashing to the floor as he reached for a brass bell and rang it vigorously, not stopping until Caradoc, a squat-faced Yoruba man, appeared, his walnut-coloured skin almost matching his uniform. Butlers, brown suits and gold braid had been unknown in West Africa, the place of his birth, but there had been slave trading, and, as a child, he had been bundled onto a ship, along with the tusks of dead elephants. Africa was only a memory. Barbados had sometimes been a nightmare. At first glance, Caradoc's expression was like that of a goat, placid and unexciting. But if the brothers had been sober, they would have seen the contempt in his eyes as he asked them what they wanted.
Viola!
Cried Emmanuel, smacking his hands down on the table, his features sharply accentuated by the candles in front of him.
I want...
He exchanged knowing sneers with his brothers before correcting himself.
We want a Viola. Fetch her.
Not here, slurred Otis, slicking his long fair hair back behind his ears. Sweat glistened on his high forehead, reflecting light from the overhead candelabra.
And not in the slave quarters either. It stinks. Let's have some comfort. No doubt the bitch will want some too. It's only right if there's 3 of us.
A sudden draught disturbed the candle flames. Spirals of black smoke curled up to Emmanuel's face, making it seem demonic. His eyes glittered.
My room, Caradoc. Take her to my room.
Otis backed down. Even when he was sober, Otis always did when Emmanuel gave orders, mostly because he sounded and looked so much like their father, Sir Sampson Strong, who always expected to be obeyed. The smiling Jeb shook his head.
No, it stinks of brandy and old farts.
Emmanuel glared. Unlike Otis, who regretted being second son and tried desperately to please both his father and his brother, Jeb was the youngest and would always be overlooked. Therefore, disagreeing with them had become something of a habit. A deep cleft appeared in Emmanuel's chin as he clenched his jaw, stood straight and clasped his hands behind his back. As the eldest son, he'd been groomed to take over the running of the business and was proud of the fact. Jeb had never been impressed, yet nevertheless, Emmanuel always strived to show him he was as ruthless and powerful as his father. Well, he'd damn well impress him now.
Supreme comfort. Father's bedroom,
he said with obvious relish, his eyes glowing with pride. Otis smiled nervously, then pushed his hair back from his face, holding on to the sweaty strands as he contemplated the enormity of what Emmanuel suggested and the possible consequences.
Oh, Lord,
he muttered, and chewed his bottom lip until the blood ran. Jeb, his face pink with drink, had a merry twinkle in his eyes, and his smile was almost a smirk.
You're not the master yet, brother. Take care.
Emmanuel was incensed.
Do you not believe I would do it, brother?
Jeb raised his eyebrows, his cheeks round and shiny.
You would violate the Holy of Holies, my brother?
Emmanuel scowled.
You mock me.
Jeb laughed and shook his head.
No, I dare you.
Otis attempted to say something, but Emmanuel, angered by Jeb's scorn, fetched him a hefty whack that sent him sprawling to the floor.
I'm going to be richer and more powerful than my father, damn you. You just see if I'm not.
He took the stopper off a quarter-full decanter, tipped it up so some of it trickled down his chin, then wiped his mouth on his sleeve.
Fetch the girl.
Emmanuel aimed a kick at Caradoc, but missed.
Well, get going, man. And bring more rum,
Otis shouted after him. Emmanuel threw him a withering gaze.
We've none left,
Otis explained apologetically. Jeb laughed quietly into his sleeve. What a desperate trio they were. Emmanuel had a need to compete with their father, but didn't even know it, and second son Otis would always consider himself to be second best, although he was a better man than Emmanuel. And me, thought Jeb, I'm like a pig's tail, pink and curly and stuck on at the end. He laughed loudly, and the sound was infectious. Soon, the others were laughing too, though they hadn't a clue why. Their laughter followed the butler as he headed into the house and the back stairs that led up to the attic, where the female house slaves slept 3 to a mattress and 12 to a room. He tried not to care about what was about to happen. Hadn't he seen it many times before? Leadenly, he dragged his legs up the winding staircase. There was no door at the top. The stairs spilled directly into the attic. Little air came through the small windows set into the steep slopes of the mansard roof, a style more suited to the climate of Bath than Barbados. The moment Caradoc approached the room, sweat broke out on his face and neck and trickled into his braided collar. During the day, the roof had conducted the heat of the sun. Like a bread oven just after baking, the heat remained, made stale by the sweat of many bodies lying naked and glistening upon the straw-filled mattresses. Reluctant to enter, he stayed by the stairs and called her, Viola. Aware that the young masters had been drinking and apprehensive about what was to come, all the women were awake but lying still, waiting to see which of them would be called upon to provide the entertainment. A communal sigh seemed to fall over the room as most of the bodies relaxed. Only one body stiffened. "Just Viola," Caradoc added. Sure now of their rest, sleep came easily for some after a 14-hour day of cleaning, cooking and laundering. Others raised their heads and looked to where Viola was rising from her rude bed, their expressions a mix of sympathy and relief. Viola started to pull a white cotton nightgown over her head. "That won't be necessary," said Caradoc, pained that he had to say it, but experienced in these things. The girl looked at him, her eyes blazing. He'd expected her expression to be one of pleading, and was surprised. All the same, he shook his head and murmured, "I'm sorry." Letting the nightgown fall to the ground and holding her head high, she followed him down the narrow staircase, welcoming the cooler air on her body as they got closer to the ground. He told her to wait outside the door that led to the cellar. Wine, rum, and a few kegs of sherry were stored there, the latter, along with flour, tea, fine clothes and fancies, brought over with the supplies from Bristol every 3 months or so. Although far from home, Rivermead House was as well stocked as Marston Court, the strong estate near the city of Bristol. At last, Caradoc emerged with a bottle of dark green glass, its neck narrow and its base balloon-shaped. "Follow me," he said, without looking at her, steeling himself to cope, though it was her ordeal, not his. Unlike other women and girls summoned like this, Viola showed no fear. In fact, something seemed to tick in her eyes. He felt she was measuring him up and, despite his stoic exterior, could read his thoughts. "There's nothing I can do," he told himself, "nothing at all." He was just a slave, had been for most of his life, and would probably remain so. Thinking of what little life he had left triggered a deeply felt anger, an anger that had lain dormant for years. "Are you not a man?" he asked himself. He'd heard that saying often of late, the confident chants of the abolitionists, unafraid in the face of men like Samson Strong. Are you not a man? In name he was a man, but in deed? A eunuch, he thought. It was a word he remembered in tales passed from slave to slave, generation to generation. He'd heard of eunuchs in North African harems, there to protect the women, but not able to love them as a man should. Just slaves, men whose penises and testicles had been cut off before puberty, now able only to pee through straws. That's how he was feeling now. Like a eunuch, incapable of being anything but a slave. Head bowed, Caradoc took Viola back up the wide staircase, where oak balustrades had been painted to look like stone, along to the wide mahogany door where light from the room within seeped onto the first-floor landing. He knocked, entered, and placed the bottle of rum onto a large satinwood chiffonier the young men's grandfather had brought out from England. The room fell to silence. Emmanuel Strong stood behind a settee. Without taking his eyes off the naked Viola, he unfastened the mother-of-pearl buttons on his waistcoat. Otis Strong was sprawled on the settee, smoking a large cigar, determined to emulate his elder brother. His eyes flickered as he gazed through the smoke. Viola stood in the doorway, looking incredibly desirable, and without the slightest sign of fear. Otis gulped. She was not what he'd expected. Jeb had already passed out. He was slumped in a chair, his head back and one leg crooked over his arm. He was snoring loudly. Emmanuel Strong lay down on the bed, his head resting on his hand. He patted the woven cotton coverlet. "Over here, my dear. Tonight I will make you a woman." Viola cocked her head. "Are you sure you can make me a woman? Are you yourself yet a man?" Emmanuel was transfixed. Otis coughed on cigar smoke, unable to tear his gaze away from the girl. Biting at the lip he'd chewed earlier, he waited fearfully to see what Emmanuel would do. He didn't like backchat from anyone, and this young woman was looking at Emmanuel as if he were the slave and she were the mistress. Emmanuel stared at her, his expression alternating between delight and disdain. The girl was unperturbed. Folding her arms across her chest, she said petulantly, "Well, are you going to keep me waiting all night?" Caradoc closed the door behind him. Muffled by the thickness of the rich, warm mahogany, he listened, wishing he had the courage of his forebears who had hunted and fought their way from desert to coast on the continent of Africa. "Are you a man or a mouse, you lazy, good-for-nothing blackass?" he muttered to himself, then stopped suddenly, as if something of the greatest importance had fallen onto his feet and pinned him to the spot. The old folks wouldn't have put up with this. Misty images of his ancestors flooded his mind, and a terrible redness rose like dust before his eyes. He saw feet, many, many feet, tramping in time to a fast-beating drum. He saw shields, spears, and felt the bloodlust of battle. Suddenly he was a warrior, just as his father had been, a man willing to fight and die, until he remembered how old he was. No, no, no. He shook his head despondently, wrinkles rippling across his face, then receding as he remembered other customs, other ways of vengeance. He waited outside the room for his chance. It was 2 or 3 hours before all became quiet, and Viola emerged. He'd expected to see her upset as he had others. Instead, she frowned at him. "What you doing here?" He looked her over and sniffed. "You smells of them. Look sweaty shiny too." "Might have got more than their smell," she said, and patted her belly. Caradoc was confused. Women were usually weeping after being cooled down to entertain the white men. But Viola had a strange look in her eyes and seemed to welcome the fact that one of them might have made her pregnant. Women were unpredictable. It was up to men to be proud. He raised a finger to his mouth and stealthily, so very stealthily, crept into the room. Puzzled and unabashed by her nudity, Viola followed and watched as Caradoc bent over the eldest brother and spat into his face. "What you doing?" "Shh," he hissed. "Old African way of showing contempt while the enemy's sleeping. When he wakes, he'll see the smug look in my eyes, and he won't know why he feels uneasy. He won't know that I insulted his spirit as he slept." "You don't need to do this for me. I can take care of myself," Viola said. "Shh," he said again, and someone stirred. Viola backed towards the door as Caradoc bent over Otis. Placing each hand on the chair arms, he braced himself so his face was only inches from that of Otis. Behind him, Jeb Strong blinked the bleariness from his eyes, saw a dark figure bending menacingly over his brother, and leapt to his feet. Before Caradoc could move, before anyone could explain, Jeb grabbed a silver candlestick and brought it crashing down on the butler's skull. Buckling from the waist, Caradoc slid down over Otis's legs and onto the floor. "My God! He was going to kill me!" Otis screamed as he awoke. His eyes were wide with horror. Blood spurted from the butler's head, trickling blackly into his collar and quickly staining the rich pile of the pale green carpet. Viola shook her head, her accusing stare meeting the eyes of Jeb Strong. "No, he weren't. He was spitting in your face, insulting your spirit while you slept. What else could an old man do?" Jeb stared down at the dead butler and let the candlestick fall to the floor. "Oh, my God, he was going to kill you," he mumbled as he took in the enormity of what he'd done. White-faced, he gazed at his brother in disbelief. "He was going to kill you," he repeated, felt sick and rushed to the window. Otis staggered to his feet, legs shaking under him. He wove his way across the room and shook his sleeping elder brother.
Emmanuel! Jeb's killed Caradoc! Do something, Emmanuel! Do something, for God's sake!
Emmanuel opened his eyes and started before the close proximity of his brother's face.
"And in our father's bedroom!"
Otis proclaimed in a shocked, hushed voice. Emmanuel hated being disturbed from sleep, and his face showed his displeasure. Expression unreadable, he got up from the bed and pushed his brother aside. With hardly a glance at the deceased, his gaze fixed on the naked Viola.
"Get back to where you belong,"
he shouted angrily. Otis pleaded,
"What shall we do?"
Emmanuel glared at Viola.
"Get rid of her. She's a witness."
Wiping traces of bile from his mouth, Jeb shivered with fear, his face still as stone.
"What you saying?"
he asked, without any trace of the usual sarcasm he reserved especially for his pompous brother. Emmanuel looked at him sidelong.
"Sell her. Do anything."
He sprang to the door, laid himself against it, and fixed a cold look on the girl.
"Anything. We have to."
"That's murder," said Viola, her voice calm yet forceful. Emmanuel tried to assess why she showed no fear. He'd been in card games with such people. Samson Strong had that same look when he was doing business. They all had one thing in common. Each of them had ulterior plans and had fixed their own agenda. Jeb remained silent. Otis was stunned, choosing to fix his gaze on Viola rather than on the dead man. Viola saw his interest, draped herself over the chair at his side and rested her chin on her hand. "No need to sell me or do anything to my mind." She shrugged a shoulder at the dead Caradoc. "He tried to poke me on your papa's bed. You was passing by and heard a hell of a hootin' and hollerin', me screamin' and that. Ain't that for the best?" Emmanuel burst out laughing.
"Clever girl. Everyone knows black men are like animals when it comes to fornication."
Swaying from side to side, as if she could hear a tune no one else could, she smiled as if she agreed, as if she had no intention of taking advantage of their own lust and the present situation. Jeb, who up until now had seemed in a shocked stupor, wailed to high heaven as he slid to his knees and clasped his hands in prayer.
"Oh, my God! Forgive me! Forgive me!"
Emmanuel frowned at the sight.
"For God's sake, pull yourself together."
He nodded at Otis.
"Get him to his feet. His behaviour unnerves me."
Otis struggled with a wailing Jeb. Emmanuel's attention returned to Viola.
"For what price?"
he asked in measured tones. Viola thrust her pretty little chin that bit higher. "I don't want to be a slave anymore. I want to be a lady." Emmanuel glanced at his brothers. Jeb was still distraught, begging God's forgiveness and resisting Otis's attempts to get him off his knees, not that Otis was putting in much of an effort. His gaze kept sliding back to Viola. He still wanted her. Badly. Emmanuel smiled.
"Then a lady you shall be, though one slightly spoilt in the making."
Sir Sampson and Lady Strong arrived from England 5 days later, their arrival coinciding with the advent of Otis's 21st birthday. This was to be a one-off occasion, father and sons inspecting the cane fields, the threshing mills, the cooperage and transport to Ship's Hold. Following this, each son would be allocated his part in the family business. One son would go home with their parents with a view to reviewing the shipping side of the business. The other two would stay on the plantations and learn about growing sugar and the management of labour. Tea was being served out on the veranda when the subject was aired. Sir Sampson and Lady Strong had been told that Jeb had killed their butler to protect a maid.
"Obviously, Jeb has to go back to Bristol,"
muttered Sir Sampson, his fine white hair fluttering like a cotton cloud around his gleaming pate.
"I had thought of leaving him here, but after this bit of nonsense—"
"Sugar?" asked his wife.
"Of course," he snapped.
"I meant how many?" she said, her smile never faltering.
3, naturally."
"Remember your gout, dear. The doctor said—"
"A quack. They're all quacks."
At that precise moment, a brightly coloured butterfly landed on his bandaged foot. Displeased by its presence, he swiped at it with his walking stick and clipped his toe.
Damn it! Bloody blast it!
Here's your tea, dear.
Damn the tea!
Lady Amelia Strong rose from her chair, her smile undiminished. The pinkness of her cheeks matched the tiny rosebuds that patterned her dress of palest pistachio green. Business talk is one thing, my dearest. Blaspheming is another matter entirely. With her head in the air and swish of silk, she went into the house. Otis's eyes strayed between father and elder brother. Jeb seemed not to notice her leaving. He was still thoughtful, staring at the floor as if it were interesting. Emmanuel's gaze remained fixed on his father, the man he most admired. Sir Sampson nodded at his eldest son as if sensing and appreciating his admiration.
Now she's gone, you can tell me more about this other matter.
He grinned broadly as he remembered younger times when he hadn't had gout and had picked his women with as much delight as a child choosing a sugar mouse.
Sly old dog, that Caradoc. Upon my word, I never knew the man had it in him. Upon my word, indeed.
He chuckled salaciously.
Was she pretty?
Emmanuel looked to both his brothers, but each seemed preoccupied, one with guilt and one with thoughts of love. It was up to him to reply.
She's very pretty.
He omitted her name, but went on to explain matters further, along the lines that Viola herself had suggested.
Upon my word,
Sir Sampson repeated, shaking his head, his fleshy jowls wobbling against his high collar.
The sly old fox.
Yes, indeed, father, said Emmanuel, his palms damp with nerves. He almost sighed with relief that his father had believed the story so easily, but he should have known better. His relief was short-lived. Sir Sampson's walking stick connected with Emmanuel's shin.
That's the truth for the law, my son. Now let's have the real truth for me.
Gritting his teeth, Emmanuel considered assuring his father that he was telling the truth, then saw the flint-hard eyes, the iron jaw. So he told the truth and watched for his father's reaction. At first his frown was like an overhang in a granite quarry, solid shadows over his eyes. But slowly his expression changed. Sir Sampson began to laugh, his face running with sweat and bags of loose fat creasing into folds around his eyes.
Stallions, he exclaimed. Fiery young stallions, just like I was in my day.
Reassured by his father's exuberance, Emmanuel relaxed and began to laugh with him. Otis too joined in. Only Jeb remained unmoved. Sir Sampson slapped the back of his eldest son, causing Emmanuel's heart to leap in his chest. He was surely favoured, the eldest son and heir to a fortune.
Like father, like son, Sir Sampson said. So, who was this midnight nymph that you took to my bed?
Confidence renewed, Emmanuel almost shouted her name. Viola, he said, and laughingly added, she wants to be a lady, in exchange for her silence.
Does she now?
Said Sir Sampson, his voice laced with a mix of sarcasm and cruelty.
In exchange for her silence. She'll have the whip across her back, or I shall sell her, ship her off to the Carolinas, where she can do no harm to this family. Ha! Lady indeed. There's no chance of that.
Detail, my dear Sampson, detail. Lady Amelia, who had obviously been listening among the shadows of the house, swept back out onto the veranda and stood between her husband and his eldest son. As usual, my dear, you have no idea of the detail in this delicate little drama. You can't sell the girl, and neither can you have her whipped. You promised her father.
Me?
Sir Sampson looked nonplussed. His wife's smile was undiminished as she towered over him. The fringes of her silk shawl fell like a waterfall from beneath her folded arms. Viola is Captain Desmond's daughter that he got on Magdalene. Her mother might be a slave, and so is Viola, but with stipulations. Captain Desmond is one of your best captains, and you promised him you'd look after her properly. That means no whipping and no selling on. Sir Sampson glared at his wife, then at his sons.
But that means I have to adhere to the bargain that these young puppies made with her," he exclaimed in amazement.
Lady Amelia's lips parted in an amused smile. My. A moment ago your sons were stallions. Now they've become puppies. She pushed past Emmanuel and fondled the head of her youngest son. For the first time that day, she turned a smile-free face on her husband. Either that, my dear husband, or one of our young stallions could end up on the gallows. Emmanuel sprang to his feet.
"They couldn't hang him. He could say it was self-defence. He thought Caradoc was attacking Otis."
Lady Sampson looked at him coldly. "You may be willing to take a chance on that. As his mother, I will not allow it." Jeb remained as silently withdrawn as he had done since that evening. His mother nestled his head beneath her breasts, her fingers running through his hair. She looked down at him. Prison would be bad enough, but look at him. He's riddled with guilt. He'll tell them he did it in cold blood purely to save his soul. For a while, time seemed suspended in silence. Only the sound of insects and the crying of seabirds disturbed the warm evening. It was Otis who finally spoke.
"She's a lovely-looking young woman," he said,
and surprised everyone. It wasn't like him to express his feelings, especially in front of his parents.
"I think I could be fond of her," he said.
Lady Sampson raised her eyebrows and looked from her son to her husband. "I take it that this is the time when respectable women should leave the room." No one responded. "I see," she said, and, for the second time that day, she left them to cogitate. The men guarded their conversation until sure they were alone. Sir Sampson looked at Otis.
"I trust we're talking about setting her up apart from the family, not moving the wench into the house."
"Well," Otis began in his usual nervous fashion.
"He does," said Emmanuel.
Otis shot him a grateful smile. Sir Sampson turned his attention to his youngest son and frowned. His other sons had come through this easily enough, although, of course, they were not the perpetrators of the killing. That responsibility lay on Jeb's shoulders.
He said, "Under the circumstances, it's best that Otis stays here in Barbados as manager of the estate."
He smiled.
"In time, we'll get him a wife, but no doubt he will not be lonely."
Otis smiled warmly, and Emmanuel laughed. With the help of his stick, Sir Sampson struggled to his feet.
"Back to England for both of us,"
he said to Emmanuel, and looked pleased at the prospect. Turning to Jeb, he said,
"I had planned for both you and Otis to stay here, but now I think it's best that you accompany your brother and me back to England. There's the shipping side of the business."
"The clergy!" Jeb had hardly spoken for days, so the sound and sharpness of his voice took them all by surprise. "I've decided to join the clergy," he repeated. His father looked fit to burst.
"Nonsense!"
Emmanuel was astounded.
"You're mad."
Jeb shook his head. "I have to do penance for my sin. It's only right."
Right.
Sir Sampson began to splutter, his face reddening as he fought for breath. Finally, he got his coughing under control. Pointing his quivering stick at his youngest son, he said,
"You'll regret it, my son. You have all this."
Jeb ran his eyes over the rich green fields, the toiling slaves and the sea beyond. Behind him was the stunning opulence of Rivermead House, though its construction and furnishings were nothing when compared to Marston Court. "I've been walking and thinking a lot just lately. I walked down to the harbour and I saw children around the Bridgetown docks. Starving they were, and dressed in rags. There's sugar growing all around, but not for the likes of them. I want to do something about it." Sir Sampson guffawed as though it were the funniest joke in the world.
"Well, you can't. You're going back to Bristol. That'll scupper that little plan, my son."
Jeb shrugged, his expression completely calm. "Barbados or Bristol? It makes no difference. There are street urchins in every city." Sir Sampson scowled.
"You'll regret it, my boy. Mark my words."
Unseen by her husband, Lady Strong watched from the shadows beyond the doorway. She smiled, and there was a look of pride on her face. Jeb saw her and knew his mother understood. He'd been born into wealth and administered to since birth. In recompense for what he had done, he would administer to the disadvantaged for the rest of his days.
"You're a fool,"
muttered Emmanuel.
"And you're the eldest son,"
Jeb said with a smile. "You have to follow in our father's footsteps, but I can do as I please." Their father interrupted.
"Manny,"
he said, his face shining with the pride of a man who knows his son is exactly as he wants him to be, a perfect copy of himself.
"Not going to disappoint me and join the monastery, are you?"
He laughed loudly. Emmanuel clicked his fingers at the new butler, whose hands shook as he filled 4 glasses to the brim with dark Barbadian rum.
"No, father."
He raised his glass.
"I promise to follow in your footsteps. Only I shall take bigger strides."
Father and son laughed together. Hating to be left out, Otis laughed too, pleased to remain in Barbados with sole responsibility for the plantation, and to be regarded enough of a man to take a mistress. Only Jeb remained silent, his eyes locking in mute understanding with those of his mother. Perhaps she knew that he woke in a sweat in the middle of the night, unable to move and crying for something lost. The slaves believed that dreams were portents of things to come. He hoped they were wrong, and that retribution would not fall on his or the heads of those he loved. Chapter 2. "I am truly blessed," the Reverend Jeb Strong said to his wife Miriam on their wedding day. He repeated that statement frequently over the next 11 years on the birth of their 6 daughters and 1 son. Life was good, and Jeb had come to believe that God had forgiven him for killing Caradoc. He often preached from the pulpit that God forgave the wickedest sinner so long as they truly repented. Spending his life in the service of God and of those less fortunate than himself, he believed, would be his enduring act of penitence. All the same, he got down on his knees every night and prayed that his happiness would continue, and that the dreaded retribution would never come. Unfortunately, it did. It had been raining for weeks. Jeb's children, Jasper, Patience, Piety, Charity, Ruth, Rachel, and Leah, pressed their faces against the rain-lashed windows, desperate for the chance to get out. "They're like parrots in a cage," Miriam Strong said.
"Now, where are you parrots hoping to fly?"
Jeb asked his children.
"India,"
said Piety.
"Jerusalem,"
Charity countered. Jeb shook his head, his eyes rolling as if all patience with his children was at an end, which was far from the truth. Jeb was a patient man. "And where do you want to fly?" Jeb asked his son Jasper, who was 8 years old and not as strong a lad as he'd like him to be.
"The South Seas,"
lisped Jasper, his voice full of wonder.
"But I'd like to sail the South Seas, not fly over them. I like the water, and I like ships."
Jeb shook his head again. "Sorry. No India, no Jerusalem, and no South Seas. But how about Marston Court on Sunday? It's your cousin Horatia's birthday, and we're invited to tea. Nelson will be there too." Just as he'd expected, the idea of getting out of the house and the city and into the country with the prospect of a good tea was enough to lift their spirits and send them off in search of bread and jam. "So will Emmanuel's new wife, no doubt," muttered Miriam, who, although she thought it only right and proper that Emmanuel's 2 children by his first marriage should have a new mother, did not approve of his choice.
"I know she's young,"
Jeb began, giving her a disparaging look. It wasn't like Miriam to dislike anyone. "That's not the point," Miriam interrupted. "Verity may well warm his bed, but her heart's cold, especially where Horatia and Nelson are concerned. If only Marguerite hadn't caught smallpox." "God's will," murmured Jeb, and said a silent prayer for his sister-in-law's soul, and also for his parents, who were drowned in a Caribbean hurricane. "Amen," Miriam said, with a heavy sigh. On the day of Horatio's birthday, thin clouds still hid the sun, but the rain had stopped. Once the children were together at Marston Court, they were accompanied outside by their nurse, whose real name was Gertie but was called Peters, as every other nurse had been. Peters was being courted by one of the footmen, who followed them out of the house. Some, but not all, of the children took advantage of her lack of attention and headed across the park, quietly past a small gathering of red deer they'd always been told not to disturb, over a stile and down to the water meadows. The river had broken its bank only a few days before, and the meadow was partially submerged. Daring, despite his delicate appearance, Jasper chose to climb a stout oak. Some of its branches dipped into the floodwater, which swirled across the meadow in a raging torrent. The girls attempted the lower branches, except Horatia, who considered herself too grown up for that. But she didn't like being left out.
"Come down, all of you, or you won't come to my birthday party."
The girls, mindful of getting their party dresses snagged on sharp twigs, got down. Much to Horatia's annoyance, Jasper stayed put.
"Jasper, if you don't come down, you can't come to my party."
Jasper did his best not to show he cared about going to his cousin's party, and swung his legs nonchalantly from either side of a branch, some 12 feet or more off the ground.
"I don't want to go to your tiresome party, Horatia Strong."
Careful so as not to slip, Jasper drew his legs up onto the branch and slowly stood up, gripping branches for support. Sharp twigs scratched at his brown velvet suit, an outfit he'd willingly see ripped to shreds.
"I can see the sea!"
he shouted, tossing his corn-coloured hair and pointing into the distance.
"That's not the sea, it's a river, you stupid boy," said Horatia. "It's just wider than usual." "I'm hungry. Can we go now?"
her brother Nelson whined, tugging at her sleeve. Leah, Jasper's youngest sister, was jumping in and out of a puddle. One of her older sisters, Ruth, pulled her out.
"Come on, Leah. We have to get back to the house before Patience and the others eat all the cake."
Rachel, the last of the 3 sisters to accompany Jasper, Horatia and Nelson into the water meadow, began bounding back up over the grass.
"Are you coming, Jasper?"
she shouted over her shoulder.
"No,"
he shouted back.
"I'm going to run away to thee." "He's always telling father that,"
said Rachel in a weary tone. Horatia folded her arms and looked up at him.
"You wouldn't dare go away to sea. Besides, you've got a bad chest." "I would," he replied. "I shall climb masts every day. I'm a good climber. Just watch me."
Nelson and Horatia strained their necks looking up, as Jasper climbed higher and higher. Without taking her eyes off him, Horatia shook her head.
"You are so stupid, Jasper. I hope Boney the bogeyman gets you. Come on, everyone. Back to the house."
Jasper took no notice. His gaze was fixed on the flooded river as it wound its way towards the Avon Gorge and the sea beyond.
"I'm going to run away to thee,"
he said softly, as a stray log bumped into the trunk of the tree before the water tugged it away. By the time he got down, the others were gone, and the light was dying. He ran back up the water meadow alone, jumping hillocks of coarse grass and reaching out for mayflies before they darted out of his way. As he re-entered the park, he looked round for the herd of red deer that had been there earlier, but was disappointed. The girls had scared them away, he decided. They were probably giggling too loud and should know better. Light from Marston Court fell out in great oblongs upon the terrace that ran along between the main entrance and the orangery. Cupping his hands, Jasper pressed his face against the windows of the ballroom, where his red-faced Uncle Emmanuel was standing next to a painting, pointing at it with one hand and waving a full glass in the other. His mouth was opening and shutting, but Jasper couldn't hear what he was saying. The room was packed. It seemed as though the whole household, right down to the scullery maids and the stable lads, had been summoned. Everyone inside seemed to be listening, even the children, which seemed stupid to him as the feast was in the other room. Avoiding having to listen to his uncle seemed a good idea. He would creep in, and sample the cakes and jellies before anyone else. He decided to sneak out through the stable yard and into the dining room through the passageway that the servants sometimes used when they were leaving for their day off. Running as swiftly and silently as possible, he darted across the swept cobbles. The door was heavy, but he managed to heave it open. It was dark inside and smelt of dampness, leather, and cabbage. And it was so quiet, and far blacker than he'd expected, and he'd never liked the dark. Heart beating fast, he tiptoed along the passageway. Halfway along, he stopped. A muffled but regular thudding sound off to his left. The shy glimmer of a candle or lantern ebbed from beneath a door. Curious to discover the source of the light, he opened it, looked down a flight of cold stone steps, and froze to the spot. A man, a very ugly man, looked up at him. The body of a red deer lay on the steps. Its eyes were glassy and staring, and its tongue lolled from its mouth. Jasper remembered what Horatia had said. Boney, the bogeyman. Boney, who'd fought the Russians. Boney, who'd marched over half the world, fighting and killing men, women, and children. He'd heard stories about him, read of the crimes in cheap penny sheets, though they said he was dead now. The penny sheets thought otherwise. And here he was, having killed a deer. And Jasper was smaller than a deer. Before Boney could grab him, Jasper turned and ran. The ballroom, where everyone was gathered, perhaps, or the kitchens. Someone must be around. He ran towards the dining room where he had meant to sample the birthday cake and all the other delights, and tugged at the door that divided the old passageway from the new one that led into the main house. It didn't budge. Jasper ran backwards, towards Boney, who was coming at him with a knife. Terrified, he sidestepped and ran up the narrow staircase that led to the top of the house and the servants' quarters. By the time he'd climbed to the top, he was breathless, and his chest pained enough to bend him double. He'd seen no one since leaving the stable yard except the man in the cellar. Although everyone had been summoned to the ballroom, he'd still expected to bump into a maid or a boot boy. His pursuer's earthy sweatiness followed him like a rancid fog. He could hear his breathing, almost as loud as his own, which now came in short, sharp gasps.
Stay there, boy. I want to hurt you.
The voice was accompanied by the tramp of heavy boots. The man was tiring, but so was Jasper. He ran as swiftly and silently as he could along the top corridor, trying each door he passed, but each of them was locked. Eventually he found one that wasn't, and pushed it open. It looked as if it hadn't been entered in years. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling and dust covered the floor. He'd thought to find a cupboard to hide in, or perhaps even someone to save him from the man with the knife. Frantic with fear, his gaze travelled to the fireplace. It was bigger than most in this part of the house, and hadn't been used in a long while. Bits of dry mortar and soot littered the grate. The iron flap that was bolted across the flue, when it wasn't in use, hung down, unbolted at the back. Jasper bent under the mantelpiece and looked up. He could see no light at the top, but could make out gaps in the mortar where he could easily get a foothold. After closing the heavy metal flue plate behind him, he climbed up into the darkness. The pain in his chest increased as he breathed in the sooty, stale air. To make matters worse, smoke seeped from the main chimney through gaps in the brickwork. Breath rasping in his ever-tightening chest, he climbed higher into the narrower part of the flue and jammed himself there, safe from Boney, warm and steadily sinking into unconsciousness.
The last time we saw him, he was sitting up a tree.
Horatia's words echoed in Jeb's mind as he stared at the swirling waters, his arm lying protectively around his wife's back.
She told him Boney the bogeyman would get him,
whimpered Rachel, her eyes red from crying.
He's frightened of Boney.
Horatia was too frightened to glare, but felt she had to justify herself.
He knows Tony's dead. He knows we beat him at Waterloo. He must do. That's why he wasn't frightened. That's why he stayed.
On seeing her words made no difference to what the people were doing, she burst into tears. Emmanuel patted his brother's neck.
There's nothing you can do here, Jeb. The tide's high, the river's swollen. He's gone.
The men from the estate had spent 2 days wading through the floodwater, probing with sticks, diving into the deeper and more dangerous waters, but had found nothing. There was normally a 40-foot difference between high and low tide. Following the heavy rain, the tidal range had increased, the ebbing waters sucking trees, carts and animals from swollen eddies. Jeb felt colder than he ever had in his life. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the tears still came. He'd promised himself that, for Miriam's sake, he would not cry. But he couldn't help it. They cried together. At last he threw his head back and looked up at the sky.
Why did this happen, God?
It was Miriam who comforted him.
There must be a reason, she said to him. God does everything for a reason.
They still had 6 daughters and each other. They were still a family. Miriam never presented Jeb with any more children. They both consoled themselves feeding the street urchins they found along Bristol's waterfront, and enrolling some in their training ship, moored next to the hole-in-the-wall tavern in the centre of the city. He wasn't sure when the dream started. There was a blue-eyed boy, thin and ragged and shiny with sugar. In his dream, he took hold of his hand, turned away, then turned back, and the boy was a man. He told Miriam about it.
Perhaps he's a replacement for the one we lost, she said. A gift from God.
Sugar from the strong plantations was landed at Redcliffe Wharf, and from there was taken by barge to one of the many sugar refineries in the city. Starving people were attracted by the sugar, though only the most desperate got past Reuben Trout, the night watchman.
There's one out there,
Trout whispered when Jeb arrived at the warehouse around 9 one night.
Good work,
Jeb whispered back. His breath turned to steam as he peered through the darkness, the light from his lantern flickering over piled casks and sweet-smelling hogsheads. Suddenly, he saw movement. A shadow still, then running.
Trout, get in, man!
Trout lumbered after the shadow and pounced.
Gotcha!
Grabbing the boy by his filthy rags, he sneered as he spat through the gap in his teeth and slammed the boy against a bank of barrels, hard enough to break bones.
No! What you been up to? Nothing!
The boy's tone was defiant. Jeb Strong held his lantern a little higher to see what manner of street urchin it was. The light picked out eyes sunk deeply into dark sockets and cheekbones that looked in danger of piercing the skin. Jeb gritted his teeth. Almost dead, he thought, and swallowed back the lump that rose like bile in his chest. There were plenty of skinny children in Bristol. Scrawny ragamuffins were almost as numerous as the rats that gnawed the barrels and sucked the molasses out through the thinned wood. Starvation had made most of them thieves. With sugar at more than £2 per hogshead on the open market, it paid to roll a barrel away when no one was looking, smash it in some dark corner, and half fill a sack before running off. Rogues, looking to turn a profit, thronged the dockside taverns from the Hole-in-the-Wall to the Shakespeare, from the Welshback to Redcliffe Wharf. There was always a market for contraband. Something shone around the boy's mouth, and Jeb knew it wasn't frost. It was cold enough, but not late enough. By the time the frost formed, well before the clocks and the bells of the city's many churches struck 12, he'd be off home, in the bosom of his family, and sitting snugly before a roaring fire, with a plate of muffins on his lap and a glass of toddy warmed with a red-hot poker. Self-consciously, the boy licked his lips. Jeb Strong was not a hard man, but prided himself on being fair. He kept an open mind as he asked, "What's that around your mouth, boy?" Trout shook the boy as vigorously as he might shake the dust from a dirt-laden mat, and the boy flopped like one, his thin white arms hanging like bare sticks from torn sleeves.
Go on, answer the reverend gentleman.
The boy's eyes rolled in his head as though they, like him, would escape if they could. Lively eyes, thought Jeb, the only bit of life in his skin-stretched face.
Sugar,
said the boy.
Been stealing the sugar, you little toe-rag,
shouted Trout, pulling the boy up by his ragged clothes so that his bare, dirty toes hardly touched the ground. Easy on the boy, Trout. Jeb shot him a warning look. The man was a bully, but the docks and dark alleys of the city were no place for those of a more temperate disposition, and his knowledge of the grimmer side of the city mostly paid dividends. Reuben Trout was sometimes employed to keep rough seamen in order, and that certainly took some doing. But this was no sailor full of rum and stinking of the confines of a sea-going bark. Shaking the lad too roughly was likely to kill him, or at least send his bones bursting through his skin. There was no flesh to stop it, that was for sure.
I licked the outside of the barrels,
the boy said, his tone still defiant despite the fact that Trout was almost strangling him.
See? Got the splendors to prove it.
He poked out his tongue. Jeb winced. It was speckled with blood. Trout cuffed his ear.
Let your cheek, lad.
Whoa! Jeb raised a warning hand. He had half a mind to slap it against Trout's dumb, ugly head. The lad's telling the truth. He raised the lantern so that its meagre glow picked out the shining traces of raw muscovado that had crystallized on the outside of the stout hogshead barrels. He traced the light back on the boy's pathetically thin face and thought of his own 6 daughters all safely tucked up in bed at home. His heart lurched in his chest as the light from the lantern fell on the boy's face. The sugar made it shine, just like the boy in his dreams. Where'd you live, son? The boy shrugged and cocked his head.
Wherever.
What's your name?
Tom.
Tom what? There was a blank look on the boy's face. Jeb tried again. What was your father's name? The boy shrugged again. Jeb sighed. Have you got a mother?
Yes.
Where does she live? The boy wiped his nose on what was left of his sleeve.
Anywhere.
She must live somewhere. Where does she sleep?
In doorways.
What about food? What does she live on?
Gin.
Jeb sighed. He had heard it all before. How does she get the money for that? The boy paused, as if afraid or unwilling to tell. At last he shivered, rubbed at his freezing arms and glared defiantly, as though his intention was to spit in Jeb's face or gob on his shiny black shoes.
Men give it to her after she'd been with them in the dark for a bit.
He said it almost accusingly, and not without a trace of bitterness. Jeb sighed and nodded at Reuben Trout. Let's give the lad a bit of a leg up in life, shall we, Trout? The night watchman's dark, bushy eyebrows almost obliterated his eyes as he frowned.
If that's what you want, Squire, though, if you ask me, he'd be best chucked in the river. I could do it if you wanted me to.
No frightening the lad, Trout, said Jeb Strong in a calm and careful voice. After placing the lamp on a handy capstan, he shook his arms out of his coat, pulled the sleeves into order, and patted the black wool almost lovingly before draping it over the boy's shoulders. Come along, lad. Let's see what we can do for you. Do you like ships? Defiance was replaced by a wariness born of both curiosity and fear. The boy, Tom, huddled into the warm coat and looked up at the one and only benefactor ever to have entered his life.
Yes.
Ever thought about going away to sea, Tom?
Sometimes.
Right. Then it's off to the Merchant Seaman's Apprenticeship School. Ever heard of it?
No.
That's fine. They haven't heard of you either. It's time you both met. Tom was apprehensive and his feet ached to run, but the man called Trout had a firm grip on his collar. The other man, obviously a gentleman and some kind of clergyman, judging by his clothes, held the lantern as they traversed the dark lanes around the city docks, where there were no decent streetlights, and the air was filled with the reek of the river, and the dampness of unused cellars. The cobbles were icy cold and slippery underfoot. The men's shoes slid occasionally, but Tom and his bare feet were hardened to it, his toes curling over the uneven surface with careless efficiency. Once the temperature had dropped to the point where the frost formed dazzling patterns on windows, he wouldn't feel them at all. Tom was used to discomfort, to being hungry and cold. He was used to being neglected and cursed. Kindness was therefore alien, and although he instinctively felt this man was genuine, he'd heard nasty stories from other boys with no one to look after them and no one to care. He had to be sure.
"Sir, where are we going?"
The man was stout, but his stride was long. He still held the lantern, the flickering flame lighting their way. "To my house, Tom. The house of Jebediah Strong, for that is who I am." Tom couldn't remember the last time he'd had a roof of any kind over his head, but he was wary. The street stories about the bad habits of wealthy men kept popping into his mind. Wriggling free was not an option. Trout held him too tightly. They left the ships and the river behind them. The temperature rose a little, and the winter wind swung round to the north. Snow began to fall. By the time they came to a brick-built house, flakes the size of sparrows' wings beat on their backs as Jeb Strong fumbled the key into the lock. Tom looked up in amazement at the imposing building. A whole street full of people who could live in a house like this. Surely it couldn't be the home of just one man. It was almost like a castle, though castles didn't have a canopy above the door like this house. At least he didn't think so. It was shaped like a seashell and captured Tom's imagination. Jeb Strong pushed him gently but firmly into the house, then turned to the man called Trout and thrust a coin into his hand. "For your trouble, Trout. I'll bid you good night." The door closed on the bitter, cold darkness, and Tom found himself in a world he had only seen through windows when the night was dark and candles and burning coals glowed from within. Just looking through those windows had made him feel warmer, which was more than the meagre rags that clothed his body could do. As Jeb Strong shook the snow from his hat, Tom took in his surroundings. Black and white floor tiles made him think of playing hopscotch. A staircase wound upwards from a lion's head newel post to a galleried landing where the light from a candelabrum shone on mahogany doors. Eyes wide with wonder, Tom rubbed his arms while his stomach rumbled at the smell of cooked food. Someone had eaten earlier that evening, and the aroma lingered, even here in the hall. The interior of the house was like a dream. Tom kept rubbing his arms, needing to feel his cold flesh, so he knew this was real, that he wouldn't wake up suddenly in some cold doorway or stinking privy, anywhere out of the snow. Not entirely convinced, he took in all the details just in case it vanished. Against one wall was a fine table, and beside it an armchair with cabriole legs and pale gold upholstery. The tick of a floor-standing clock measured the passing of time, though it seemed slower than his beating heart. Tom jumped as the clock struck 11. Jeb Strong placed a hand on his shoulder, and he jumped again. "No need to fear, boy," said the cleric on seeing the sudden suspicion in the boy's eyes. "It's just a clock." Tom headed for the door, suddenly disbelieving and wary of Jeb Strong's true purpose for bringing him here. Some men preferred boys to women. His friends in the street gangs had told him that. A number of them had got so hungry they had acquiesced to the demands of such men and had told him what sort of things they'd been forced to do. A house that specialised in such things had even taken one of the boys in. But Tom would rather starve. Jeb Strong folded his hands before him and shook his head. "You're free to go if you wish. Believe me, Tom, I mean you no harm." Tom reached for the door, meaning to run into the darkness and face the familiar cold and hunger, even though his belly was rumbling and his flesh was frozen. The sound of footsteps running lightly along the galleried landing, followed by a female voice, made him pause. "Is that you, Jeb?" Jeb smiled and winked at Tom. "My wife asks an unnecessary question if ever there was," he said, then upturned his face to the landing and said more loudly, "And whom else would you be expecting at this time of night, my dear? Do you keep secrets from me?" The woman giggled. A long shadow thrown by the candlelight preceded her before she appeared, wearing a pale blue brocade dressing gown over a lace-trimmed cotton nightdress, her hair covered by a large muslin cap. She rested her hands on the balustrade and looked down at them. In the light from the candelabra, her eyes looked bright and merry. "I have a friend with me," Jeb added, and Tom fancied that both the man's voice and his overall demeanour had softened and warmed in the presence of his wife. Her voice was like singing. Tom was spellbound. "Another lost and lonely boy? Goodness, my dear, however many are there?" Jeb ruffled Tom's filthy hair. "Too many and all in need of help, but with the Lord's help we'll do what we can." "Amen," said Mrs. Strong. "Amen," echoed her husband, then added, "What have you got for young Tom to eat?" She pressed a finger to her dimpled chin, and her merry eyes turned thoughtful. "Well, to start with, cook made lamb stew for our dinner tonight. I'm sure there's plenty left in the kitchen, along with bread, butter, and milk. Ample enough for a growing boy, I think." Swiftly businesslike, she began to trip down the stairs, her voluminous attire floating out behind her like a blue cloud. More sounds came from further along the landing. Tom looked up. Mr. and Mrs. Strong exchanged knowing glances. "They should be in bed," said Jeb Strong. "They're young and curious, like we were once," his wife said. Scurrying along like large mice, a host of little girls appeared, ranging in size and age from 3 to 13 or so. They all wore white cotton nightdresses and had healthy pink faces that looked newly woken from sleep. Wobbly knobs of ragtide hair bounced all over their heads as they followed their mother down the stairs. "My daughters," Jeb explained proudly, as they all gathered round him, arms entwined. Tom gazed at them, wide-eyed. If he'd ever had that sort of treatment from anyone, he didn't remember it. Mostly he remembered being alone in the cold, while some ugly stranger grunted and groaned above his mother on the small bed they'd shared between them in the distant past, when they'd at least had a roof over their heads. And he'd been warned to be silent, as if he wasn't there, a nobody who had had to survive as best he could. Later, as Tom devoured the food set before him, 6 pairs of eyes watched silently, the smaller ones only just managing to peer above the table. "Tomorrow he enrolls in the Merchant Seaman's Apprenticeship School," the Reverend Strong declared to his children, as though it were an event of historic importance. The eyes of the little girls seemed to grow larger. The truth of the matter was that it was Jeb Strong himself who had set up the school for destitute boys, and he was immensely proud of his achievement. A maid, lately roused from her bed, followed Mrs. Strong into the kitchen, which now seemed full of people, warmth, and an irrepressible determination to dispense Christian goodness. Both Mrs. Strong and the maid carried various items of clothing dangling over their arms. "These used to belong to my son, Jasper. They're quite clean," said Mrs. Strong, measuring a coat across Tom's back as he tore at the bread and spooned the stew into his mouth. He barely acknowledged their presence. Clothes that would keep him warm would be welcome, but nothing could beat hot food. The last time he'd eaten a hot meal was when one of his pals had found a cat run over by a cart. They'd skinned it, skewered a stick through the length of its body, and cooked it over a driftwood fire. It had tasted good to a hungry boy, but nothing like this.
"Will I be fed at this school?"
he asked Mrs. Strong as she tucked him into bed. Mrs. Strong blinked back her tears and brushed her hand over his hair. "Of course you will, child." Later she told her husband what he had said. "Poor boy," he responded. "It is a shame he's had such a bad start in life, for I'm convinced he has a quick mind." His voice trailed away. Thoughtfully, he sat on the side of the bed and slipped off his shoes. Miriam Strong looked at him sadly.
"You're thinking about Jasper."
Jeb sighed, took off his wig and scratched his head. His face turned shiny in the light from the lantern, just like the boy in my dream. Miriam threw up her hands in delight.
"I knew there was something. I could see it in your eyes."
She came round to her husband's side of the big oak bed, knelt at his feet and cradled his face in her hands.
"God's sent us a replacement. That's what the dream meant. Can you possibly doubt it?"
Jeb slowly raised his head until his gaze met hers. "Do you really think so, Miriam?" Miriam kissed him gently on the mouth.
"Do our best by him, and he could be a living memorial to Jasper's memory."
Jeb smiled and nodded sadly. "God moves in mysterious ways. There's always a purpose, and if it's God's will, then so be it." He squeezed his wife's hand. "You've the last word on the matter, Miriam. Is it really God's will? And would Jasper agree?" She smiled at him, clutched his hand with both of hers, and dragged him with her onto his knees.
"Let us pray, husband, and perhaps by morning we shall know for sure."
Next day at the quayside, Tom felt small. He knew he was thin, though quite tall, but the size of the ship Jeb Strong took him to made him feel tiny. The Miriam Strong was strongly curved from prow to stern, though the gold, red and blue paint around the tight windows of what had once been the captain's cabin and officers' quarters was faded and peeling in places. Her mainmast seemed to touch the sky, and the fore and aft masts, lesser height, and crossbars were like supplicants to its majesty. Tom was a wharf rat, a street urchin familiar with the city centre quays and the ships that berthed there. He'd seen barks, brigantines, trows and packets, but none had been quite as splendid as the Miriam Strong. He eyed her with interest, then frowned. Something was wrong. Jeb saw his expression. "What's wrong, lad?" Tom chewed over whether to mention the matter, but decided he would.
"She's got no figurehead."
"Ah!" Jeb exclaimed. He sounded as if he'd been found out doing something he shouldn't.
"Why?"
Jeb looked downriver to where the tower of St. Mary Redcliffe Church cast its shadow over the water. "I'll tell you some day," he said. By the tone of his voice, Tom could tell the subject was closed.
"I thought I was going to school before going to sea,"
said Tom with sudden wariness. He'd heard about gangs in years gone by who had pressed men and boys into service before the mast, though Jeb Strong didn't look as though he belonged to a gang. He was a clergyman, after all, though you could never be too sure of the motives of rich men. Jeb Strong smiled, his chin doubling and trebling above his clerical collar. "This is the school, Tom, where you will live and learn all that Captain Gooding and this ship can teach you. And don't think the Miriam Strong is just a rotting old tub. This ship has not been to sea for many a long year, though she's seen plenty of action in her time. She's fought in some very famous battles."
"Don't sound like a man of war to me with a name like that,"
said Tom. "I named her after my wife." Jeb grinned in a wicked way, not at all in keeping with a man of the cloth. "There's many a tale this ship could tell, Tom, and she's had more than one name. Trust me when I say she's a ship to be proud of, a ship that generations henceforth will remember with affection and wonder." Tom looked as though he almost believed him, then returned his gaze to the spot on the prow where her figurehead should be.
"So, what was her other name, then?"
Jeb winked. "Not for you to know, lad. One day, maybe, when it doesn't matter who knows, and those that would be concerned about how I got her are dead and gone. That's when you will know, Tom." But Tom was no longer listening. He was looking towards the hole in the wall, a waterside inn where rough men gathered to drink and do business out of sight of the customs men. A woman was screaming, and a man was swinging her around by the hair, slamming her body against the wall of the age-old building.
"Ma!"
shouted Tom. Like a skinny hound, he was off, running towards the pair, shouting, then launching himself at the man, his head thudding into an unprotected midriff. At first the man was surprised. He let go of the woman, his prime objective now to protect his own body rather than abuse hers. But he recovered quickly, his brawny arms making light work of lifting the boy above his head and making as if to slam him down on the pavement. "Henry!" shouted Jeb. He rushed towards the melee, sure in the knowledge that Captain Henry Gooding, master and teacher on the Miriam Strong, was right behind him, and with all the confidence of a man of strong muscle rather than wide girth, his black frock coat flapping like the wings of a bat behind him. Waving his walking cane, he shouted, "Put that boy down, my good man!" The brute looked surprised that someone was giving him an order. On seeing that Jeb was no waterside bully, surprise turned to a sneer, until Captain Gooding, a man of over 6 foot, put in an appearance. He had a massive beard, and his hair was plaited into short pigtails all over his head. "What his neck broke, Reverend?" Gooding's voice was surprisingly high, not at all suited to the size and density of his frame. Jeb looked undecided. Captain Gooding advanced menacingly. His shadow fell over the man, and Tom was quickly released. Tom immediately went to the woman, who was lying against the wall, groaning and shaking her head from side to side. He knelt down at her side. "Ma, are you all right?" She looked at him blearily, as if she didn't know him, or was waiting for her vision to clear. Once it did, she began to groan louder. "I ain't got nothing for you, Tom. I told you to get out of my bloody sight. What are you doing here?" Tom straightened suddenly, as though he'd thought something over very carefully, and had now come to a decision. "I'm going to sea, Ma. I'm going to go to school on that boat. The gentleman there said I could." Jeb stood silently, curious as to what response Tom's mother would give. She looked at her son with tired eyes from beneath a thatch of tangled hair that had once been dark brown, but was now peppered with grey. "Best thing for you," she said wearily. "I can do without you hanging around my skirts." The brute who had thrown her against the wall found his confidence returning, although his bravado had diminished. "Come on, woman. You owe me a shilling's worth, and there's more than one dark doorway in this street." Tom helped his mother to her feet. Jeb sensed the bond between mother and son. Whatever she was, Tom loved her, and for just a moment he thought he had seen a flicker of affection in her eyes. "Go on with your fancy gentleman, Tom," she suddenly exclaimed, brushing him aside before waddling off to her client's side. "I got a job to do, ain't I, darling?" "I'll look after you when I'm a proper seaman," Tom shouted after her. He heard her laugh, and the man's deeper baritone join in as they sauntered off. "I mean it," he said more quietly. It was the last time Tom saw his mother alive. 1 week later, her body was fished from the river. Her throat had been cut, and she was naked. Jeb took Tom to identify her, although he said he didn't have to. Jeb also took care of the funeral arrangements, rather than have her buried in a pauper's grave. "Now he's got no one," Miriam said to Jeb 2 weeks after the funeral. Jeb patted her hand. "I think he's got us now, Miriam." "Good," she said, brushed the back of her hand across her eyes, and went back to her sewing. Together they told Tom about their decision. "We lost our son, Jasper, some years ago, but we never once doubted that God had taken him for a reason. We think you are that reason, Tom. We believe God sent you to be our son in his place." Tom was amazed, but wondered if his luck could change yet again. "What if your son Jasper comes back? Will you throw me out on the street?" Jeb Strong reached for his wife's hand and smiled at her as he squeezed it. He shook his head. "He won't be back. We believe he drowned, and the waters took his body out to sea. It was God's will. You've no surname, Tom, so what say you I give you mine?" Tom fell silent, his eyes downcast. At last he said,
"Do I get to stay at the school, on the ship?"
Jeb nodded, unable to stop smiling each time he looked into Tom's eyes. They were so like Jasper's, blue and honest. "Yes, if you want to." Tom thought about it for a moment.
"Suppose I can't argue with God?"
Miriam clapped her hands. "Praise be!" Jeb could see by the look on Tom's face that the boy had something else to say. At last, it came out. Tom's deep blue eyes looked up into his, the dark lashes seeming to intensify their liquidity rather than making them larger. He swallowed nervously and cocked his head a bit like a bantam just before a fight.
"Just so as you know, I won't ever forget me mother, even though she was a whore and met a sticky end."
Jeb winced. The boy spoke so matter-of-factly, and yet he sensed the turbulent emotions running just beneath the surface. He didn't want to think what the boy might have had to witness. "I understand, Tom. You'll never forget your mother, and we'll never forget our son." He nodded at his wife, and they took his hands and led him to another room that had obviously once been Jasper's. The bed was made and the curtains were drawn, just as if the boy was about to go to bed. A hoop and a hobby horse were propped up in the corner. There was a top on the floor, books, a wooden boat with sails, and a regiment of red-coated soldiers lined up in battle against their green-jacketed opponents. The only sign of mourning was a strip of black cloth hanging around a portrait. Tom looked up at the painting.
"Tom, meet Jasper,"
said Miriam Strong. The boy that looked back at him was probably a little younger than Tom was now. Strikingly blue eyes, similar to Tom's own, smiled out of the painting. Jasper had crisply ginger hair. Tom's was dark. Jasper held a toy with both hands, a mounted knight on a painted horse, the cross of St. George emblazoned on his chest. "My son," said Jeb. And Tom wasn't quite sure whether he was referring to the boy in the portrait or him.
"He was wearing those clothes the day he left,"
said Miriam Strong. She sounded regretful, as if she wished she'd been there to see him off, as if he'd merely gone off on a trip to relatives or friends. And took his toy with him, thought Tom. It didn't look to be among those in the room. "So, do you want to be Tom Strong?" asked the Reverend Strong in a kindly voice. Tom thought carefully before answering. Even though his mother was dead, he was fiercely proud. Begging for a name was something he'd never stooped to. But Jeb was offering, and he seemed a good man.
"As good a name as any,"
he said. Forgetting the bloated face of his mother wasn't easy, but living and learning on board the Miriam Strong helped Tom enormously. He enjoyed the lessons on seamanship. He even liked learning how to read and write, and became so far ahead of the other boys that Jeb Strong took him home on occasion to join his daughters with their tutor. Gradually, he became part of the family, and Jeb told him so. Only when he first accompanied them to Marston Court, the home of Sir Emmanuel Strong, Jeb's brother, and his family, did he feel otherwise. While the adults congregated in the dining room and dined on wine-rich pheasant, wild duck, fat geese, and a broad saddle of beef, the children were fed boiled mutton, semolina, and bread and butter up in the nursery. The nursery was on the 4th floor and was furnished to be of service rather than to impress, like the rest of the house. The windows were small, and the walls were painted a dull mushroom colour that did nothing to lift the gloom and compensate for the lack of light. Nelson Strong, Sir Emmanuel's son, took to Tom immediately, which caused his sister Horatia to scowl. It seemed to Tom that she considered her brother to be her property and hers alone.
"Do you have a pony?"
Nelson asked brightly. Tom shook his head, but wished he could say yes. He so wanted to fit in. Nelson made a face.
"Neither do I. I hate riding and shooting and things like that. I like theatre, nice clothes and looking handsome. Do you like poetry?"
Tom was unsure, though disinclined to admit it.
Yes.
Nelson reclined in his chair like a Regency dandy, his older female cousins in rapt attention and hanging onto his every word. Leah, Ruth and Rachel sat like puppies at his feet.
Do cite some for me.
Tom scratched his head as he thought about it, then recited the only poetry he knew, the first lines of a sea shanty he'd heard sailors singing as they fell out of the dockside taverns along St. Augustine's quay.
Oh, Betsy is a buxom wench, she's tasty and she's willing, and she'll do anything you want if you've just got a shilling. So hoist 'em up, me pretty girl, oh, get 'em down, me darling, for I'm a-sailing shortly now, and you'll not get a farthing.
Charity, Piety and Patience, Jeb's eldest daughters, threw their hands over their mouths to stifle their giggles. Ruth, Rachel and the very youngest, Leah, not quite understanding the sentiments, grinned hesitantly, Leah eventually clapping her hands in childish delight. Nelson beamed. Not exactly Richard Brinsley Sheridan, but very entertaining. The only one who did not laugh was Horatia, Nelson's older sister. They were very alike, both golden-haired and blue-eyed, though Nelson was but a weaker imitation of his sister, like a reflection in foggy glass. Horatia glared hard at her brother, who suddenly looked ashamed of liking the rude ditty. Horatia was angry.
Shut up, all of you!
Her voice was like the crack of doom. The children fell into silence. Nelson seemed to shrink in his chair, his semolina spoon slipping silently into his dish. Tom had been wary of Horatia from the moment they'd arrived. Although he'd bowed to her and said good afternoon, she had not responded, but had looked him up and down as if he was still in rags and wore no shoes. Only when everyone else was out of earshot did she whisper, "You're wearing a dead boy's clothes." He'd felt himself colour, and was only glad that no one else heard what she'd said. The Reverend Strong's daughters sat like stones in their chairs as Horatia's eyes raked over them, her look far too disdained for a child of her age. Her gaze finally settled on Tom, just as he'd expected it would. "You don't belong here, and we have no wish to hear your dirty dockside songs from your dirty mouth and the dirty place you first came from." Tom clenched his jaw and resisted the urge to hit her. After all, she was a girl and Jeb's niece. Horatia held herself like an adult, a haughty look on her face and her blue eyes hardening to suit her mood. Everyone stayed silent and still, afraid to move, lest her stony look fell on them. She said, "You're a brute of a boy, do you know that? You're not our kind at all." For the Reverend Strong's sake, Tom had no wish to rock the boat. Without returning her gaze, he went on eating, sure that in time she would tire of her game and leave him alone to torture someone else. "Well, brute, aren't you going to say anything?" Tom carried on eating, and would have continued to do so, but Horatia made the mistake of saying the worst thing possible. "Your mother was a whore, and you never had a father. There's a word for a child like you." Tom let fly his bowl. Horatia herself sat dumb and immobile as dribbles of semolina trickled down her face and into her open mouth. A deep hush fell. Then Leah began to giggle. Gradually, each of her sisters began to giggle too. Tom showed no emotion, but kept his eyes fixed on Horatia's face. Nelson merely stared into his lap, a wry grin flickering over his lips. As the giggles grew into loud laughter, Horatia's stone features cracked with rage. She opened her mouth wide, threw back her head, and screamed, "Nanny Peters!" The scream soared on the air. The sound of footsteps ascending the stairs quickened, and a small figure in a dark dress with a white apron and mop cap dashed to her darling Horatia's side. "Oh, my poor dear!" the nurse exclaimed. Of course, the whole story came out. Tom knew he was in for a birching. The Reverend Strong wouldn't let him get away with reciting rude verses in the presence of young ladies and behaving as he did towards Horatia. Tom was summoned to the library at Marston Court, where the Reverend Strong waited, a bundle of birch twigs in his right hand. He sighed and shook his head at Tom. "I have to do this, boy, though I don't want to. You do realise that, don't you?" Tom nodded.
"Yes, sir."
At the crook of the Reverend Strong's finger, he made his way to the corner where he was standing behind a big green chair.